In September 2002, what began as a normal night shift at a small-town convenience store in Rusk, Texas, spiraled into a nightmare of violence, fear, and unimaginable cruelty. Two young women, Candace Driver and Nikki Daniels, and a mentally challenged man named Kenneth Vandever were simply trying to make it through the evening, until two masked men with shotguns burst through the door. What followed was a horror story ripped from the darkest corners of the human psyche. A triple abduction, a brutal sexual assault, and a cold-blooded execution in a remote field under the cover of night. Only one victim would survive, and her testimony would help bring justice. The man behind the shotgun was Richard Cobb, a 19-year-old drifter with a chaotic past and a dangerous companion. For a few stolen dollars and a twisted thrill, he shattered 3 lives and shocked an entire community. It would take over a decade, countless legal battles, and one haunting final statement before Cobb met his end inside Texas's most notorious death chamber. And what he said with his last breath: "You'll never forget it." To truly understand how this quiet East Texas town became the site of one of the most disturbing crimes in recent memory, and how Richard Cobb reacted when the needle went in, we need to rewind the clock to where it all began. But first, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon, because this story won't just stay on screen, it'll stay with you. Richard Cobb was born on May 12, 1983 in Texas, a state known for its rugged terrain, southern values, and in certain corners, deeply rooted poverty. From a young age, Cobb's life was defined more by what was absent than what was present: a stable home, consistent parental guidance, and a structured future. Court documents and interviews suggest that Cobb experienced a childhood marked by neglect and emotional disconnection. He was described by those who briefly crossed paths with him as a quiet and detached young man, intelligent but distant, polite, yet unnervingly cold. As he drifted through adolescence, Richard found himself frequently unsupervised and increasingly alienated from conventional society. With little access to meaningful support systems, he gravitated toward petty crime and bad influences, including Bunka Adams, a slightly older man who would later become his partner in one of Texas's most brutal crimes. By the age of 19, Cobb had already encountered the juvenile justice system, exhibiting early signs of aggression and antisocial behavior. But while some young offenders reform, Richard Cobb seemed to grow more emboldened by the system's brief detours. Behind his soft-spoken demeanor was a storm of resentment, disillusionment, and a dangerous disregard for human life that few recognized, until it was too late. On the late night of September 2, 2002, Labor Day, what began as an ordinary shift for two young women working at a small-town convenience store would soon spiral into a horrifying ordeal that would leave a permanent scar on the quiet town of Rusk, Texas. Richard Cobb, along with his accomplice Bunka Adams, both armed and masked, entered the B&B convenience store with malicious intent. They weren't just there to rob the store. Their actions would unfold into a sequence of violence and terror. Inside the store were two employees, Candace Driver, 37, and Nikki Daniels, 23, as well as a 37-year-old mentally disabled customer named Kenneth Vandever. The gunman, brandishing a sawed-off shotgun, quickly gained control of the situation. In an act of cold calculation, they forced all 3 victims at gunpoint into Candace Driver's Cadillac. The group was driven several miles out of town, deep into a remote East Texas pasture under the cover of darkness. Their destination was no accident. It was isolated, quiet, and perfect for what Cobb and Adams had in mind. In the eerie stillness of that desolate field, the 3 terrified victims were ordered out of the car. One by one they were forced to their knees, a chilling and symbolic position of submission. Kenneth Vandever, helpless and confused due to his cognitive disabilities, was the first target. Without hesitation, Richard Cobb raised the shotgun and fired point-blank into Vandever's body, ending his life instantly. The murder was brutal and deliberate, intended to assert dominance and eliminate a witness. Next, the terror turned toward Nikki Daniels. While Candace Driver was made to watch, Daniels was subjected to a degrading sexual assault by Bunka Adams, an act of cruelty and domination that added to the already nightmarish situation. After the assault, both women were shot, Cobb and Adams each taking turns firing at the 2 helpless clerks. Candace Driver was shot fatally. Nikki Daniels, although critically wounded, had the instinct to drop to the ground and remain absolutely still. She later testified that she consciously chose to play dead, hoping the killers would believe she had already succumbed to her injuries. Quote from Nikki Daniels' testimony: "I laid there. I didn't move. I waited for death, but it never came." In a miraculous twist of fate, Nikki Daniels survived the ordeal. Despite being shot and left for dead in a cold, dark field, She managed to crawl toward the road once her attackers fled the scene. Her testimony would later prove pivotal in the prosecution of both Richard Cobb and Bunca Adams, helping to paint a vivid and harrowing picture of the night that forever changed her life, and ended the lives of two innocent people. Just days after the brutal attack at the abandoned convenience store in Rusk, Texas, law enforcement agencies, acting on critical tips and forensic evidence, arrested both Richard Cobb and Bunca Adams. The shocking nature of the crime had already sparked fear and outrage across the community. Authorities moved quickly. Ballistic evidence matched the weapon used in the shootings, and descriptions provided by the sole surviving victim helped tie both men to the scene. During initial police questioning, Cobb initially remained quiet, emotionless, his demeanor cold, detached. But under pressure and faced with mounting evidence, Cobb eventually confessed in a chilling and detailed statement that left investigators stunned. He admitted to the entire sequence of events: the abduction, robbery, forced sexual assault, and ultimately the execution-style shootings of Kenneth Vandever, Nikki Ansley, and Candace Driver. His confession lacked any real expression of guilt or remorse. According to officers present, he described the crime with clinical precision, as if recounting an errand, not a life-altering act of violence. Bunca Adams would later also confess, though each man occasionally shifted blame onto the other. In January 2004, Richard Cobb's trial for capital murder began at the Cherokee County Courthouse. The prosecution painted a vivid, harrowing portrait of a calculated, senseless crime that left one man dead and two young women physically and psychologically scarred for life. District Attorney Elmer Beckworth led the state's case, arguing that Cobb had deliberately and coldly executed Kenneth Vandever, an innocent man who had no chance to defend himself. The courtroom listened in silence as the 911 call was replayed, and Cobb's confession was read aloud. Richard Cobb showed no remorse, the prosecutor told the jury. He executed a helpless man, dragged him from the car and shot him in the back simply because he could. There was no mercy, no humanity in that act. Survivor's testimony, Nikki Ansley. Then came the most emotional testimony of the trial, the court appearance of Nikki Ansley, the surviving victim. With a trembling voice, Nikki described in painful detail how she and Candace were separated from Kenneth, led into the darkness and sexually assaulted. She recalled the deafening shots and the feeling of waiting to die as Cobb stood over her with the gun. "I remember every sound, every second," Nikki testified, tears streaming down her face. "He told me to run, then changed his mind, then told me to stop again. I thought I was going to die right there. I don't know how I'm alive." She went on to describe the helplessness of seeing her friend Candace shot and lying wounded nearby. The emotional weight of her statement was palpable in the courtroom. Many jurors struggled to hold back tears. Nikki described Cobb's face, emotionless as he carried out the attack. "He looked at us like we were nothing. Like our lives didn't matter at all." Victim impact statement, Kenneth Vandever's family member. "Kenneth was a gentle soul," said a cousin of the victim in a recorded victim impact statement. "He didn't deserve to die like that. Richard Cobb took away a son, a brother, and a friend. My family will never be whole again. There's an empty seat at every holiday now." The defense tried to argue that Cobb was heavily influenced by Adams and that he had a difficult upbringing marked by abuse and neglect. But the jury was unmoved. After days of intense testimony and only a short deliberation, Richard Cobb was found guilty of capital murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the emotional scars on the survivors unshakable. On March 5, 2004, the court handed down the ultimate sentence: death by lethal injection. Richard Cobb, then just 24 years old, was transferred to Texas death row in Livingston. Justice the families believed had been served. But for those who lived through that night of horror, no verdict could erase the trauma. The scars would remain forever. Following his conviction and death sentence in 2004, Richard Cobb began the slow march through the labyrinth of the American capital punishment system. Housed at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in East Texas, Cobb would spend the next 9 years confined to a solitary cell measuring just 6 by 10 feet. Like all death row inmates in Texas, he was under 23-hour-a-day lockdown with limited human interaction, restricted movement, and minimal access to the outside world. From behind bars, Cobb and his legal defense team launched a series of post-conviction appeals. They argued multiple grounds for relief, primarily centered around procedural issues, due process violations, and the effectiveness of his trial counsel. The defense contended that certain elements of Cobb's mental state and upbringing had not been fully presented to the jury, potentially influencing the outcome of the sentencing phase. However, both the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the federal courts systematically denied each of his petitions. The courts found that the claims either lacked merit or did not meet the strict legal standards required for reconsideration under habeas corpus law. As the years dragged on, so too did the psychological weight of death row life, a place where silence is broken only by the echo of cell doors slamming, the occasional shuffle of guards, and the grim procession of other inmates being led to their final destination in Huntsville. In April 2012, Cobb's co-defendant, Bunka Adams, who had also been sentenced to death for his role in the brutal triple abduction and murder, was executed by lethal injection. His final words were defiant and unrepentant, a sharp contrast to what would come from Cobb a year later. Adams' execution closed one chapter of the crime, but for Cobb the clock was still ticking. By early 2013, with all legal options exhausted and no stay of execution granted, the state of Texas scheduled Richard Cobb's execution for April 25, 2013. As the date approached, the prisoner's time became tightly regimented, visitation schedules arranged, a final meal chosen, and spiritual advisors made available, in accordance with standard death row protocols. For the victims' families, it was the beginning of a long-awaited resolution. For Cobb, it was the final countdown toward justice served in the eyes of the state. As the sun began to set over East Texas on April 25, 2013, a grim quiet settled over the death row unit at the Allen B. Polunsky unit. Inside its heavily fortified walls, Richard Cobb, now 29, awaited the inescapable conclusion of the justice system's verdict. After more than a decade behind bars, the countdown to his execution had reached its final hours. In Texas, where special last meal requests had been abolished in 2011 following public outcry and abuse of the privilege, condemned inmates were no longer granted the opportunity to select a customized final meal. Instead, they were served the standard meal being prepared for the general prison population that day. Richard Cobb was no exception to this policy. Although prison officials did not publicly release the specific items on his tray, it was confirmed that Cobb did consume the standard prison meal offered to him. Unlike some inmates who refused to eat in their final hours, choosing instead to fast or express defiance, Cobb accepted the food quietly. There were no dramatics, no unusual demands, no lingering conversations, just the simple routine act of eating. A final, human moment in a life that had spiraled into chaos and tragedy. This last meal, though mundane, carried weight. It was the final act of normalcy before the irreversible. It marked the end of Richard Cobb's time on earth, not with indulgence or ceremony, but with the ordinary and the routine. There was no fanfare. No special requests. Just the institutional silence of a prison kitchen and a tray of food delivered with procedural efficiency. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the prison grew heavy. Death row was accustomed to silence, but execution days carried a different kind of stillness, a suffocating quiet, where every footstep echoed like a warning. At some point, Cobb was escorted from his cell and taken to the Huntsville unit, also known as the Walls unit, where Texas executions are carried out. There, in the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber, Cobb was allowed a few final privileges. He was offered the opportunity to make a phone call or meet with spiritual advisors. Whether he accepted these options remains undisclosed, but what is known is that he appeared composed and talkative in his final moments. On the evening of April 25, 2013, the weight of justice and finality hung heavy in the air outside the Huntsville unit in Texas. A small group of protesters stood in vigil, candles flickering against the encroaching darkness, while inside the prison's red-bricked walls, the machinery of capital punishment moved forward with clinical precision. At precisely 6:27 p.m., Richard Cobb was pronounced dead by lethal injection, bringing an end to a life that had spiraled into darkness and violence. But before the lethal drugs coursed through his veins, Cobb delivered a set of chilling philosophical final words, words that both disturbed and mystified witnesses. With no trace of fear or hesitation, he faced those present in the chamber and calmly stated, "Life is death, death is life. I hope that someday this absurdity that humanity has done, the human race itself, that we evolve past this. Life is too short to harbor feelings of hatred and anger. That's it, Warden." As the execution drugs began to take effect, Cobb's demeanor remained shockingly calm and even eerily enthusiastic. In a final, surreal moment that unnerved observers, he smiled, craned his neck toward the warden, and with a bizarre sense of peace said, "Wow. That is great. That is awesome. Thank you, Warden." Moments later, with a final breath and the world slipping away, Richard Cobb left behind not just a legacy of violence, but also a haunting echo of a man who, in his last seconds, seem to embrace death with a strange and unsettling grace. Richard Cobb's story is one of pain, power, and consequences. But at its heart, it is about the victims, those who didn't walk away. In remembering them, we remind ourselves of what justice truly means. If you or someone you know is affected by violent crime, reach out. Help is out there. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Share their stories. Don't let them be forgotten.